What if perfection wasn't a goal but a curse? Behind Hollywood's golden lights and crimson carpets lies a truth no one dares to say out loud. Some stars were not destroyed by scandal, drugs, or enemies, but by the unbearable weight of being flawless. They didn't fall from grace, they were crushed by it. Imagine Stanley Kubrick, lost in an endless loop of takes, each frame a battlefield against imperfection. Or Grace Kelly, who wore the role of a real-life princess so well, it devoured the woman beneath the crown. These weren't victims of Hollywood, they were willing martyrs to its impossible standards. This isn't just another list of stars and their secrets. This is a procession of lives consumed by the mirror, by the role that never ended, even when the cameras stopped rolling. For some, like Daniel Day-Lewis, perfection meant retreat. For others, like Vivien Leigh, it meant madness. We'll look at 20 icons, actors, actresses, legends, who believed that greatness meant never slipping, never aging, never showing weakness. Who paid for their art with their sleep, their joy, their minds, and sometimes their lives. So, before we begin, what do you think perfection truly costs? And by the end of this story, ask yourself, was it worth it? Fact. Stanley Kubrick. He didn't just direct movies. He engineered obsessions. Stanley Kubrick was known for his uncompromising vision, but few knew the toll it took. During the filming of The Shining, he reportedly shot a single scene 127 times, not for technical perfection, but to break the actors down. He wanted real exhaustion, real madness. It wasn't enough to simulate it. He had to extract it from their bones. Shelley Duvall, pushed to tears daily, later described it not as acting, but surviving. Jack Nicholson slept on set, too mentally fried to go home. Every camera angle was an equation, every shadow calculated like a military operation. Kubrick demanded not just the best, it had to be absolute. But perfection comes with isolation. He rarely gave interviews. He moved away from Hollywood. His later life was a locked room filled with reels, scripts, and anxiety. Even his family said they sometimes couldn't tell whether he was present or lost inside a frame. So the question lingers. Was Kubrick chasing perfection? Or was he running from everything less than it? Fact #2, Grace Kelly. She became a real-life princess, but the role cost her everything. Grace Kelly was Hollywood royalty long before Monaco made it official. Her image, icy, untouchable, perfect, was cultivated with precision. Alfred Hitchcock called her the paradox of fire and ice. Yet that paradox wasn't just for the screen. Off-camera, Grace carefully curated every step, every smile. Imperfection had no place in her world. When she married Prince Rainier III, she retired from acting at 26. Many believed it was a fairy tale ending. In truth, it was an eternal performance. She was no longer allowed to act by royal decree. Her scripts were swapped for protocol, her characters for ceremonies. The studio of Monaco had no retakes, no creative freedom, just expectations. She reportedly kept diaries filled with regret, confessions about roles she would never play, emotions she would never express. The woman who once ignited the screen was reduced to a symbol carved in porcelain. So tell me, was Grace Kelly's most iconic performance the one she never got to leave? Fact #3, Daniel Day-Lewis. He disappeared. Not by accident, but by design. Daniel Day-Lewis is considered one of the greatest actors of all time. He didn't play roles, he became them. For My Left Foot, he stayed in a wheelchair between takes. For There Will Be Blood, he isolated himself for months to inhabit the character's madness. Critics called it genius. Co-stars called it haunting. But genius has a shadow. After Phantom Thread, he announced his retirement not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of having to become someone else perfectly every single time. He once said, "I have to believe in the reality of the character so much that I cease to know where I end and he begins." Day-Lewis didn't burn out in public. He walked away before the fire consumed him. He now lives in near seclusion, refusing interviews, rarely seen. Some say he's at peace. Others say the man behind the characters never truly came back. What kind of perfection demands that you erase yourself just to create? Fact #4, Vivien Leigh. She became Scarlett O'Hara and never escaped her. Vivien Leigh won immortality with Gone with the Wind, but the role didn't just define her, it devoured her. Playing the tempestuous Scarlett required emotional extremes that mirrored her own fragile psyche. Audiences fell in love with her fire. Studios demanded she burn brighter. Behind the camera, Leigh struggled with bipolar disorder, swinging between euphoria and collapse. But she hid it because imperfection was not allowed. She worked through breakdowns, through failed takes, through miscarriages. To remain a star, she had to remain a mask. Later, even when she played Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, Friends whispered that she wasn't acting anymore, she was simply breaking in public. Her illness deepened, her beauty faded, but she refused to step away, even when the industry turned cold. So when does a role stop being a character and start becoming a cage? Fact. #5. Fred Astaire. He made dancing look effortless because he suffered to hide the effort. Fred Astaire was a master of grace, a symbol of elegance. But the myth of his lightness was built on a foundation of obsession. He rehearsed endlessly, sometimes repeating a single step hundreds of times until it was invisible in its perfection. On the set of Royal Wedding, he reportedly forced retakes until the floorboards split beneath his shoes. He refused body doubles. He choreographed every movement, not just for himself, but for his partners who often cried off stage from the pressure. Astaire believed perfection wasn't a goal, but a duty. If audiences noticed the effort, he had failed. He once said, "If it doesn't look easy, you're not working hard enough." But what happens to a man whose entire legacy is built on pretending nothing ever went wrong? Was Astaire dancing toward glory or running from the fear of falling out of rhythm? Fact #6. Judy Garland. She was expected to shine even when she was breaking. Judy Garland's rise to fame was orchestrated by MGM, who saw in her the perfect American sweetheart. But perfection required control, and Judy was controlled from the start. The studio altered her teeth, her weight, her voice. They fed her pills to keep her thin, then more to make her sleep. By the time she filmed The Wizard of Oz, she was already dependent on medication and emotionally unstable. Yet no one intervened. She had to remain Dorothy at all costs. Her pain was part of the performance. Later in life, her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but she kept performing. She needed the stage, but it no longer needed her. Her breakdowns were public, her comebacks short-lived. She died at 47, alone in a London bathroom. Was Judy ever given the chance to be anything less than perfect, even for a moment? Fact #7. Gene Kelly. He turned musicals into masterpieces and himself into a machine. Gene Kelly redefined male grace on screen. Unlike the airy elegance of Fred Astaire, Kelly's style was grounded, muscular, masculine. He wasn't just dancing, he was commanding the frame, and he demanded the same perfection from everyone around him. Kelly choreographed with mathematical precision, often pushing his partners to exhaustion. Debbie Reynolds once said, "Making Singin' in the Rain with him was harder than childbirth." But Kelly didn't bend. Every step, every camera angle, every smile had to be engineered to dazzle. Over time, his relentless standards became a wall. Collaborators distanced themselves. Studios labeled him difficult. As taste shifted away from musicals, Kelly found himself isolated, still demanding perfection in an industry that no longer cared. What happens when a man builds a palace of discipline only to find himself the last one inside? Fact #8. Elizabeth Taylor. She lived under the spotlight until it blinded her. Elizabeth Taylor was more than a movie star. She was an empire of beauty, scandal, diamonds, and roles that defined a generation. But the public didn't just watch her, they expected her to stay perfect forever. Every wrinkle, every mistake, every weight gain became front-page news. Taylor worked tirelessly to uphold her image. Multiple marriages, Oscar wins, comebacks, hospitalizations. Through it all, she had to be Liz, the untouchable goddess. But that goddess bled. Behind the scenes were addiction, painkillers, near-death experiences, and decades of emotional wreckage. Even when she launched AIDS activism and broke barriers, the press still asked about her looks, as if the woman inside her myth never mattered. So who was Elizabeth Taylor when no one was watching, and did she ever get to meet that person? Fact #9. Anthony Perkins. One role made him immortal and made him disappear. Anthony Perkins was an actor of immense subtlety and talent, but when he played Norman Bates in Psycho, he achieved something most stars never do. He became iconic overnight. The problem? No one ever let him be anyone else again. Producers typecast him, directors doubted him, fans only saw the knife. Perkins tried to break the mold with Broadway roles, dramatic turns, even European films, but Norman followed him everywhere, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Behind closed doors, Perkins hid his sexuality, fearing Hollywood's judgment. He lived a double life, smiling for the cameras while fearing exposure. He died of AIDS-related complications in 1992, still remembered, almost exclusively, as the man who stabbed Marion Crane in the shower. Can an artist survive when the world refuses to see beyond their most perfect moment? Fact #0. Audrey Hepburn. Elegance was her armor and her prison. Audrey Hepburn wasn't just stylish, she defined style. Her delicate features, soft voice, and composed presence became a global template for grace. But beneath that serenity was a survivor of war, hunger, and loss. She didn't pursue elegance. It was the only thing that made her feel safe. Hollywood fell in love with the Hepburn type, refined, distant, perfect. Audrey obliged. Even as her personal life crumbled, she maintained the image. She was careful with interviews, guarded with emotions. Her wardrobe was curated, her public words polished. Behind the scenes, she suffered miscarriages, heartbreaks, and long periods of depression. Later in life, she became a UNICEF ambassador, finally channeling her pain into something beyond image. But by then, the world had stopped listening. They wanted the breakfast at Tiffany's girl, not the woman who had outgrown her. So did Audrey craft elegance, or did it consume her? One still pose at a time. Fact Haitian Montgomery Clift. He made pain beautiful and lived in agony. Montgomery Clift was the original tortured heartthrob. His performances weren't just emotional, they felt wounded. He brought vulnerability to masculinity long before it was accepted. But that honesty came at a price. He didn't act his trauma, he mined it. After a near-fatal car crash in 1956, Clift's face was reconstructed. But his spirit wasn't. He became addicted to painkillers, alcohol, isolation. He hated the label tragic actor, yet couldn't stop living the roles that broke him. Judgment at Nuremberg, Wild River, The Misfits. Each performance drained him further. Directors praised his rawness. Co-stars admired his intensity, but he couldn't turn it off. By 45, he was gone. The autopsy read, natural causes. But what was natural about a man spending years drowning inside himself? Did Clift ever get to act without bleeding into the performance? Fact cancelletunodue. Rita Hayworth. She was Hollywood's love goddess, but she hated the woman on the screen. Rita Hayworth lit up the 1,940 seconds with sultry dance numbers, fiery eyes, and roles that turned her into a wartime pinup dream. But behind that glamour was Margarita Cancino, a shy, intelligent woman remade by the studio system. They straightened her hairline with electrolysis, changed her name, rebuilt her accent. Her most famous role in Gilda haunted her for decades. She once said, "Men go to bed with Gilda and wake up with me." She married 5 times, including to Orson Welles and a literal prince, but none lasted. Each man expected the myth, and when reality arrived, they left. In her later years, Hayworth suffered from early-onset Alzheimer's, misdiagnosed at first as alcoholism. The real woman faded long before the icon did. So what happens when you become a fantasy no one allows you to wake up from? Fact Hasson 3. Kim Novak. She became the perfect illusion and couldn't wake up from it. Kim Novak was never meant to be a star. She was meant to be a projection crafted, posed, molded by the studio to compete with Grace Kelly. But it was Hitchcock who turned her into a ghost. In Vertigo, Novak played a woman playing a woman. Layers of identity folded into performance. The lines blurred on screen and off. Hitchcock was meticulous with her appearance. Blonde hair, specific costumes, mannerisms, rehearsed like ritual. The character of Madeline became a trap, and Novak spent years trying to prove she was more than that single haunting silhouette. Critics weren't kind. Studios grew cold. She disappeared, reappeared, disappeared again. Each return marked by discomfort, by the need to correct the narrative, to reclaim her name. So how do you rebuild yourself when the world only remembers your shadow? Fact Hasson 4. Peter O'Toole. He chased artistic immortality and found a bottomless void. Peter O'Toole exploded into legend with Lawrence of Arabia. Tall, magnetic, articulate, he seemed born to command the screen. But behind the brilliance was a man consumed by the pursuit of the sublime. O'Toole didn't want to act. He wanted to transcend. His career became a pattern of astonishing highs and brutal crashes. For every critical success, there was a self-destructive bender. Friends called him brilliant. Directors called him impossible. He sought roles that burned, and let them burn him too. By the 1,980 seconds, his body was failing. But he kept pushing, chasing that perfect performance, that flawless line reading that might outlive him. In the end, he earned 8 Oscar nominations and no wins. It was poetic, in a cruel way. Can perfection be beautiful if it leaves you empty? Fact Hasson 5. Dean Stockwell. He never got to choose who he was until it was too late. Dean Stockwell began acting at age 7. MGM owned his childhood, down to the expression on his face. He was the good boy, the serious child, a fixture in 1,940 seconds films, always poised, always obedient. But inside, he was drowning. As he grew older, the roles faded. He quit acting more than once, only to return because it was all he knew. Stockwell reinvented himself in the 1,980 seconds edgier, more enigmatic, but even then, he confessed, I've spent my whole life becoming people I wasn't allowed to be. Late in life, he turned to visual art, finally expressing something unfiltered. But the damage was done. He had lived a career dictated by perfection, direction, and silence. So what happens to a man who spends 60 years performing and never finds his own voice? Fact: Hashanice, Jean Tierney, perfection made her famous. Then it tore her apart. Jean Tierney was the portrait of 1,940 seconds beauty, symmetrical, cool, unreachable. She was the face of a generation. But behind those flawless features was a woman unraveling. Tierney was obsessed with being everything Hollywood needed her to be: elegant, composed, luminous. But life doesn't respect symmetry. After giving birth to a disabled child due to rubella contracted from an overzealous fan, Tierney fell into a guilt she never escaped. She continued working, smiling, maintaining the image, but the cracks widened. Eventually, she checked herself into psychiatric clinics, underwent shock therapy, and lived with lifelong mental health struggles. She once said, "I used to walk past mirrors and not see myself. Because the self Hollywood sold wasn't real, it was a mask stretched too tight. How much of your soul can you give away before there's nothing left to perform?" Fact: Hasson 7, Greta Garbo. She achieved perfection by vanishing. Greta Garbo was unlike any star before or after. Ethereal, unreadable, hypnotic. She gave the world masterpieces and then took herself away. At the peak of her fame, she quit. No grand scandal, no meltdown, just silence. Garbo loathed interviews, premieres, photographs. She believed in mystery, in privacy, in keeping the illusion intact. To her, perfection meant never being exposed. She walked the streets of New York for decades afterward, alone, wrapped in coats and sunglasses, as if still hiding from the spotlight she had once ruled. People speculated endlessly. Was she reclusive? Was she depressed? Or was she finally free? Is vanishing the ultimate perfection, a way to control the narrative before it controls you? Fact: Hasson 8, Charlie Chaplin. He built a perfect clown and watched the world turn against him. Charlie Chaplin wasn't just a genius, he was a symbol. The tramp became a universal figure, transcending language, class, borders. But Chaplin's perfection was meticulous to the point of mania. He often shot scenes hundreds of times, pushing actors to tears. He edited for months, obsessing over frames like a surgeon. But his flaw wasn't artistic, it was personal. He refused to separate the man from the myth. He involved himself in politics. He questioned America's morality, and America punished him for it. In 1952, he was banned from re-entering the US. His image, once beloved, was smeared as unpatriotic, immoral. He spent decades in exile, still making films, still chasing brilliance. But the silence was louder than the applause had ever been. So what happens when the man who defined perfection becomes the target of its destruction? Fact: Hassonanen, Laurence Olivier. Perfection wasn't enough. He had to transcend mortality. Laurence Olivier was not just a performer, he was a force of will, a titan of stage and screen who sculpted every movement, every vowel, every breath into something greater than human. But that brilliance came at a cost. Olivier didn't act. He crafted cathedrals out of suffering. Behind the curtain, he was haunted by self-doubt. He feared being average. He feared being forgotten. He once confessed that he could only feel alive when he was pretending to be someone else. The man who gave us Hamlet, Othello, and Heathcliff barely knew himself off stage. He worked through illness, heartbreak, and war. Even as his health failed, he continued to perform because rest felt like death. And in the final years, when the spotlight dimmed, Olivier was lost without it. So did he become legendary, or did he vanish inside the legend? Fact: #20, Natalie Wood. She spent her life performing and died in a mystery that still feels scripted. Natalie Wood was raised to be a star. Her mother pushed her into acting at age 4. By 10, she was already a veteran of the screen. She grew up surrounded by cameras, applause, and constant reminders that image was everything. Be perfect, her mother said, or be nothing. Wood internalized it. She controlled her body, her voice, her career. She fought to shed the child star label, diving into adult roles filled with pain and complexity. But the fear never left. She feared drowning. She feared scandal. She feared being exposed as imperfect. In 1981, she died under mysterious circumstances, drowning off a yacht with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken on board. The case remains open. The theories are endless. In the end, Natalie Wood became what Hollywood always wanted: a symbol, frozen in beauty and tragedy. So was her greatest role the one no one was supposed to see? Bonus fact: Margaret Sulavant. She was never the biggest star, but she lived the tragedy they all feared. Margaret Sullivan didn't dominate headlines like Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn, but to directors and co-stars, she was electric, refined, intelligent, with a voice that carried both charm and sorrow. She demanded creative control in an era when women rarely had it. But with that control came pressure, and with pressure came collapse. Sullivan was intensely private, fiercely exacting, and emotionally fragile. She chose scripts carefully, obsessed over performance, and refused roles that felt dishonest. But Hollywood didn't reward restraint, it rewarded myth. She watched others become icons while she wrestled with depression and the creeping sense of invisibility. In 1960, at the age of 50, she was found dead from a barbiturate overdose. It was ruled an accident, but those close to her weren't so sure. Shortly before her death, she had written in a letter, "I was never allowed to fail in peace." Unlike others, she didn't chase the spotlight. She ran from it and still couldn't escape the demand to remain impeccable. So perhaps the deepest tragedy is this: even those who refuse the pedestal are still destroyed by what it represents. Perfection built their legends and shattered their lives. In the end, these stars weren't undone by scandal or failure. They were undone by success, so flawless it demanded everything. The applause was real. So was the silence that followed. But now we turn to you. Which of these stories felt the most haunting? And do you believe perfection in art is worth the destruction it leaves behind? Let us know below.